very excited to be performing here at Lyndhurst Mansion for their holiday party. We're going to be performing in the Parlor, which is a wonderfully balanced acoustic space. There's a sweet spot right in the middle where I can stand and it just resonates. You can hear it coming up through the floorboards into the portrait gallery, and you're going to be able to experience music in the mansion in a way that would have been very similar to what the families that used to live here 100 to 150 years ago would have experienced. So that's a very exciting prospect for me. Santa Claus, Christmas Symphony, written in 1853, is the very first piece to use the saxophone in a symphonic setting. Saxophone has been used throughout the 19th century in different types of settings, but 1853 in the United States was the first for a symphonic setting. It was written by William Henry Fry, an American composer, but it was performed by an orchestra that was coming over from Europe. Louis Julian, who left from London with a clarinetist who also played saxophone. And they took a tour of Boston and New York City. So in December, 165 years ago, they played this piece. And it was probably the first time anyone in this country ever heard a saxophone. A lot of the music that you get to hear on this program, you can't find it. You have to really hunt. And part of my project is to track down this music. So I finally found who has it. The Fleischer Library in Philadelphia has the handwritten score. Through many phone calls and some great help, they scanned the entire score and sent it to me. I then adapted it, because we're not bringing an entire orchestra into the Lyndhurst Mansion. I adapted it to harp and soprano saxophone. So I maintained that saxophone that William Henry Fry wrote for, which just sounds wonderful in the parlor of Lyndhurst Mansion. In the Christmas Symphony, there's a number of parts that the composer writes what they're supposed to represent. And so the first section that we perform is called the lullaby, probably trying to evoke the idea of the children trying to get them to sleep so that Santa can come. The whole symphony ends in a version of O Come All Ye Faithful, which is a wonderful way to kind of wrap up that whole amazing piece in the adaptation we're going to present at Lyndhurst. Howard, thank you for talking with me. I'm excited to be here at Lyndhurst. Can you tell me a little bit about where we are, where Lyndhurst is located, who built this magnificent building?
Lyndhurst is actually very interesting because it's just north of New York City, and it's built in the 1830s at a time when New York was becoming the leading financial capital of the world. It was first built by William Paulding, who was a former New York mayor. Alexander Jackson Davis, who designed the house, was also in that mix of New York City artists, architects, writers, who really formed the nucleus of the first big burst post-revolution, post-War of 1812, of really American homegrown intelligentsia, essentially.
And Davis builds a number of well-known places in this New York City, Hudson Valley area.
Davis not only builds places in New York and the Hudson River, he really is the first architect in the United States. He is one of the founders of the American Institute of Architects. So he was it. He was the big architect. And what's important at Lyndhurst is this is really the moment in American architecture where you go from classical architecture, the architecture of Thomas Jefferson, the red brick, Center Hall colonial, to Victorian architecture and Romantic architecture. And that happens very early at 1838.
So after William Paulding, the house moves on to another owner.
That was the Merritt family. They're the ones who probably have the biggest impact on Lyndhurst, but the ones about whom we really know the least. When the Merritts come and buy the house, it's about half the size that you see today. By the time of the Civil War, it wasn't big enough. So the Merritt family brings Alexander Jackson Davis back. He doubles the size of the house, but in doing so, he really doesn't add a lot of public rooms. Adds a bigger dining room, adds a couple of bedrooms upstairs. Really what he adds are all the behind-the-scenes service spaces that you didn't have. Lyndhurst is interesting in that essentially it really had three families that owned it. And it was sold as a country house from one to the next. So one of the things that we're lucky about is that we actually have all the furnishings that were designed for it from the beginning that stay more than less with the house. You're actually looking at the actual things that were here as decorated and placed by one of the families that owned it.
So tell me more about the third owners. After the Paulding and the Merritts, it then goes to Jay Gould and his family.
So Jay Gould starts from a farming community in the Catskills. He is not like the Astors.
So he wasn't born into wealth.
No, he was not born into wealth, and unlike the Vanderbilts and the Astors, who at that point already had a good period of businesses or real estate ownership that they were basing their wealth on, he made it himself. Mm-hmm. One of the interesting things about Jay Gould and Lyndhurst, and the reason that it's preserved, he was actually a very decent father and family man. His children truly loved him, and when he passed away, they preserved this house, not because it was so architecturally significant, but because they had fond memories of him, and they loved him.
Very often in classical music, people put together a program and then take it to many, many different venues. And it really doesn't matter what the venue is, it's kind of generic. And I wanted to do something very different than that. I wanted to create a program of music that was unique to the place it was being performed. So here at Lyndhurst Mansion, I researched who were the prominent families, what kind of social connections, who might have visited them at Lyndhurst, and picked music that would be really specifically suited for this site.
To all mankind the clearest, which peasant like king may reach. I am here as it were in December, and you are in May up above. Oh, send me a bud to remember the spring's first promise of love. Oh, send me a bud to remember the spring's first promise of love.
Another story that this program tells is that of how the social elite were not only patrons of the arts. They would hire the greatest craftsmen to build beautiful cabinets and wardrobes, but they would also hire amazing painters to paint portraits or purchase some of those artworks. But they would also hire composers and sponsor the arts. Not only were they interested in doing that, but some of these families were interested in being a participant. William Fullerton Jr. was the son of a very famous trial lawyer, William Fullerton Sr., who was invited to go on trips with the President of the United States of that time. So that was the social circle his father was in. William Fullerton Sr. was in the newspapers of New York City for representing people like Jay Gould, Cornelius Vanderbilt. Anytime there was a kind of dispute, business dispute, something had to get solved, he was one of the go-to trial lawyers. His son was born in Newburgh, New York, right here in the Hudson Valley, and was the only son of William Fullerton. And William Fullerton wanted his son to follow in his footsteps. He was a big disappointment to his father, unfortunately. Not only did he not want to follow in his father's footsteps, he was gay. And this was a point in history where being gay in New York City was highly controversial and not entirely safe. There was a good possibility that you would be committed to an asylum if you were homosexual. So William Fullerton Jr. goes to London. And London at that time of the late 19th century, the Gilded Age, actually allowed him to live openly with another man. Interestingly enough, his father never accepted him being gay, but he didn't disinherit him. He didn't disown him. He went and made frequent trips to London to try to convince his son to come back. And William Fullerton Jr. ended up dying very early, very young, at the age of 34 from tuberculosis. When you hear the songs that we're going to be performing, you can just imagine, well, what would have happened if he had survived? Because you can hear his already prodigious talent in his compositions. We're doing 3 of his songs. One is called The Locket Song, which was from a very lavish opera called The Lady in the Locket. It wasn't just about the singing. It wasn't just about the music. There was lavish costumes and sets and stage effects. It was a huge production that was very popular and very successful. And he was going to write further operas, and unfortunately, his career was cut short.
While as through a byway old and one day wandered I, at my feet a locket golden fell as from the sky. Rich and quaint, fitting shrine for such a saint as the masters loved to paint in the days gone by. Golden locket, rich and quaint, fitting shrine for such a saint as the masters loved to paint in the days gone by.
Most of the year around, Lyndhurst is a museum where you can take tours and view all these things. But come holiday time, you guys do something special.
I will say we do it at different times of the year as well, because we do want people to have the opportunity throughout the season to experience Lyndhurst a little more as a home. It was not built as a museum. And just like we're sitting in this picture gallery talking, we want people to have those opportunities. So we like to have concerts in one of the rooms or one of the buildings of the mansion, whether in the carriage house, where we oftentimes do things. Sometimes we'll do them outside, which is also lovely. And especially for the Christmas season right now, what we do is we have music in the parlor. So the way parlors were generally used is after dinner, the family would come back to the parlor and they would talk and converse, and that was oftentimes where you'd have music played. You'll be performing a Gilded Age concert in a week or so for our annual Christmas party, with the idea that you're coming as a guest of the Goulds to a Christmas reception. So it's a very lovely way to actually allow people to experience chamber music in the way it was written and intended to be performed. And when you come to Lyndhurst and you hear musicians perform, the sound of the rooms is really quite true and quite wonderful. And you really understand that unlike chamber music that's played in a concert hall now, which is huge and far away, that the music was actually written to be in a small, intimate space. And what's great about it is you can hear everything. It's like you're in the musician's laps. You can hear the musicians breathing, you can hear any glitches that they make, you can hear the, like if you're playing strings, you can hear the scratching on the strings, so it's really wonderful.
For
when you
me
hear
playing
that.
saxophone, you'll hear the keys opening and closing because it'll be that intimate.
Yeah, so it's really that kind of thing, and it's a wonderful way to experience Lyndhurst, and we try to do that throughout the year so people really can understand this not as a museum, but really as the type of house that it was intended to be.
Through the silence of the night, sudden melody is thrilling, changing sadness to delight. All the gloom with music filling, Philomel in lonely sorrow, pouring forth a tuneful lay, hopeful of a better morrow. To my heart you seem to say, cease, thou sad one, cease to mourn. Hope and joy may yet return. Cease, thou sad one, cease to mourn. Hope and joy may yet return. Cease, thou sad one, cease to mourn. Hope and joy may yet return, may yet return, may yet return.
The fourth daughter of John D. Rockefeller was Edith Rockefeller McCormick, McCormick being her married name. And she wrote the lyrics for another piece that we're going to be performing here at Lyndhurst Mansion. Now, Edith suffered from depression at a time when that carried a fairly large stigma. Edith made the newspapers and Time magazine because she was telling everyone that she was the reincarnation of the first wife of King Tutankhamun. This was at a time where there was a lot of exploration being done of Egypt, and so she made all the papers because of her claims for being the wife of King Tutankhamun.
How can we know? How can we know? We know by the silence of like satisfied hearts. We know by the clarified glance that darts from the longing but joyful face of the one to the joyful and longing face of the other, and no earth-stained judgment of men, and no fire-proved power of the gods can take this knowledge from us, for we know through the trust born of love.
As I've mentioned, the Vanderbilt family were not only patrons of the arts, but participants. So Cornelius Vanderbilt Jr. was serving in the First World War, and he was in France. And eventually someone came up and said, we need someone to drive a car for one of the British generals. Does anyone here know how to drive a Rolls Royce? He's a Vanderbilt. Of course he has experience driving a Rolls Royce. So in addition to driving that Rolls Royce, he also wrote the lyrics to the song we're going to perform called Courage. Now, when Cornelius Vanderbilt returned from serving in the First World War, he got into the newspaper business. He wrote for the New York Times. He started some of his own newspapers. His family detested the newspapers. So they ended up disowning him, disinheriting Cornelius Vanderbilt. Very often, the children of these social elite ended up having these very strained relationships with their family. Cornelius Vanderbilt Jr. is disinherited from the Vanderbilt family, which is that's quite a fortune to be disinherited from. But we're going to get to hear some of his music on the program.
Courage. Courage. The snow is a field of play, and the longest hill has a well-worn way. There are songs that shorten the longest night. There's a day when wrong shall be ruled by right.
The harp was an instrument that was popular in many of the music rooms and salons of the 19th century. I would take many tours throughout historic houses, and I'd always get to the music room, and I would always ask the tour guide whether I could play the instrument, and they always tell me no, which is very frustrating to me as a musician. I feel that the houses come alive when there's music in them. These homes were meant to have music. Very often you'll find a piano in these music rooms, you'll find a harp, and so we are utilizing the harp in the program for Lyndhurst Mansion. It's an instrument that is appropriate for these music rooms, that conveys the intimacy of what it would be like. It wouldn't be a concert where everyone sits quietly and no one interacts. It was much more casual. There would be stories, there would be music, and the harp helps us capture that sensibility. Talk to me a little bit about music and the pianos that lived here at Lyndhurst.
Before you had electricity, you basically had to entertain yourself. So literally, if you were a young lady, whether you liked it or not, you probably played a musical instrument, you probably sang a little, because that's what you did. You read, you entertained, you put on little plays. You had to do it for yourself. You couldn't just spend endless hours on your iPhone finding out about things all around the world. By the second owners, the Merritts, we see the piano that was in the reception room, and we know they also had a second piano in the parlor, because again, you might only have music in that reception room, listening to that separately, but oftentimes after dinner, if you were in the parlor, you might have somebody play music, one of your guests, one of your family members, for people sitting around at that time as well. So they had that in two places.
I know that very much at this time it was almost popular, if you were a wealthy family, to marry off your daughters either to British royalty or French royalty. So was Jay Gould interested in marrying off his daughters, or?
He was not, and I would say generally speaking, for example, many of his sons who got married showgirls. His daughters had two very different situations. The eldest daughter, Helen, was all wrong for society at the time. She was described by one of the New York papers as plain, plump, and not interested in society. So she goes to NYU Law School at a time when I think there are only 2 schools that will admit women.
Wow.
And later becomes one of their benefactors. Doesn't get married till she's in her 40s, marries a guy she loves. They adopt children together. She didn't play dress up. She actually sort of did the things you would think a modern, affluent woman would do. She had a philanthropic organization. She championed women's economic equality. She built Ys for soldiers and other disadvantaged people all across the country. So she was a real force. Her younger sister, rather, Anna, is under the age of 18 when Jay Gould dies. He dies in his early 50s. Helen helps raise her. They send her off to Paris for finishing school, and while there she meets Bonnie de Castellan, Count Castellan. So she ends up marrying him. When she finds out that he's cheating on her, she later divorces him and marries his cousin, the Duke of Talleyrand. But the reason she can divorce is because he doesn't get her money. And so what's interesting about it, though, is, and this is where the difference comes for those people who've watched Downton Abbey, what they know is that Cora who is American, is married into the British aristocracy, and her money goes to her husband to stay with the family estate, which eventually will go to this other person who inherited it because her husband ultimately did not. Jay Gould sets up his family such that his daughters and his sons are all treated equally. He does something where each of the siblings has to agree to the marriage of the other sibling.
That's
so
unusual.
That whoever is, it is very unusual, but whoever's coming in, that protects the money.
There are 2 programs, or 2 stories behind the program here at Lyndhurst Mansion. The first is a coming-of-age story. So in this case, I call it a gilded coming-of-age story of an instrument, and that instrument is the saxophone. The saxophone was invented in 1840 by Adolphe Sax, who was from Belgium, but he went to Paris to really do most of his work. So the saxophone is invented in the 1840s and then becomes used more and more. Now, for most of us, when we think of saxophone today in the 21st century, we might think of jazz, or we might think of Bruce Springsteen's band, or some kind of pop rock. And the saxophone is such a versatile instrument that it lives very well in both of those styles. And it had a whole life in the classical world before jazz was even invented. And so I'm trying to tell that coming of age story of how the saxophone went from invention right before the Gilded Age and how it became, by the time you get to the beginning of the 20th century, one of the most widely popular instruments in the United States. One of the pieces on the program is called Fantasia. This is composed by Jean-Baptiste Saint-Gelais, who is a good friend with Adolphe Sax, the inventor of the saxophone. And Saint-Gelais really encouraged Adolphe Sax to expand it to not just one instrument, but a whole family of instruments. And Saint-Gelais is one of the first composers to really take the instrument seriously as a composer and compose music for it that has the melodic and harmonic and timbral richness that you would associate with any of the great classical instruments. Florio was born in England, but was diagnosed with an illness very early. And his doctor said the only way that he would get cured and not die was to have a long sea voyage and get fresh sea air. And so his parents took the whole family, got on a boat, and came to New York City. Carroll Florio at that time, that was actually a pseudonym. His real name was William Robjohn. And he became the first boy soloist in the Trinity Church Choir in New York City. He stayed in New York and became a prominent composer. He met a saxophonist named Edward Lefebvre, who came to the United States from France and decided to make it his mission to show the world the possibilities and the capabilities of this amazing instrument. So Edward Lefebvre toured the entire United States showcasing the saxophone. And Carroll Florio wrote a number of pieces for this French virtuoso. And in 1879, he wrote the very first piece for solo saxophone as a soloist with an orchestra backing him up. We're going to do a version with the alto saxophone and harp replacing the orchestra. What's particularly interesting, tying into the social elite that is also a part of this program, is that Carroll Florio ends up being hired to be music director at the Biltmore Estate. This is part of a larger project that I'm calling Music of the Gilded Age in the Hudson Valley. And the idea behind this project was to research what music was like in some of these wonderful historic houses and buildings throughout the Hudson Valley. To do some research, look into how was music performed, who was it performed for, were there any famous guests that came to dinner and then played some music after that dinner. So do that research into site specifics. And so part of my project is to put on a program in the setting you would have heard it and allow you to experience it. So imagine instead of just going to a concert hall, you drive down a winding road through the trees and the manicured lawns and the formal gardens, and you see this beautiful building, down a ways. You go into the building and you see beautiful decorative arts and paintings, and then you get to hear exquisite music from the late 19th century, and that immersive experience is what I'm trying to achieve.
Through eating pickled salmon, before I went to bed. A flight of wildest fancies went booming through my head. The world seemed topsy-turvy, and people of renown were doing the most outrageous things when the world turned upside down. Jay Gould, he was a Quaker and bossed a spelling match. Vanderbilt had a railway scheme he somehow couldn't match. Mr. Tilton was an emperor and wore a golden crown, and Beecher danced the can-can when the world turned upside down. Brooklyn had changed into a sort of paradise on earth, for it had had some trials, and one heard no ribald. The people of this mighty globe were all just what they seem. There was an end to rings and jobs when I woke and 'twas a dream.